right, y'all. Wow. There is a lot going on right now in the world of Bravo. Yeah. So I am going to do a little bit of an emergency mental health checkup episode on specifically what's happening on Real Housewives of New York, because this type of content is exactly what we can offer a little bit of additional information about, given what we know about all sorts of things like relationships, mental health, trauma, and so forth. So first, a content warning. This will include topics of sexual violence. Sexual violence is an umbrella term for rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment, incest, and sexual abuse, which has more of an ongoing quality. If you have survived sexual violence and would like to speak to someone about it, the National Sexual Assault Hotline is 1-800-656-4673. 1-800-656-4673, and I'll put it in the notes as well. You can also Google National Sexual Assault Hotline and you'll find a chat feature and a website. I also want to include a note here in the content warning that Brynn does not herself really own the word rape, nor does she own the word survivor. First, to the latter point, I will be using the word survivor to indicate her strength in surviving what she went through, even if she is still thinking of herself as a victim, potentially, which she didn't necessarily say either, but she's entirely entitled to either word, totally up to the survivor, which one they use. I will also be using the term sexual violence rather than rape per se. Rape indicates forced penetration, which can be oral, vaginal, or anal penetration with a sex organ of the other person. She doesn't seem to be owning that word. We didn't hear it on the show. I'm not sure if that's because it's a big word or if it's because what she's referring to didn't actually involve forced penetration and was therefore more like sexual assault. Sexual assault can include, if not rape, groping, digital penetration, which is use of fingers or other objects, or really fingers in that case, but also other objects. That's considered aggravated sexual assault by many states. Other forms of sexual assault might be attempted rape, fondling, or unwanted touching. So I just want to be really clear about definitions right up top. There are distinctions among the terms, and I'm going to use the more umbrella term of sexual violence throughout. Okay, I want to give my thesis. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what happened for sure, in case anybody wasn't able to see the finale, but you've heard a lot about what's going on, or maybe you watched it but sort of didn't understand certain things, or maybe you've forgotten and you can't take the time, or you just don't have the time. Not that you can't take the time, but maybe you can't. But you don't have the time to rewatch it. I'm going to give you a little bit of a rundown of the whole scenario there. So I will try to be brief because Dr. Ray and I are also going to do a full recap episode of the finale later on, coming up in the next week or so. So I'll give a quick rundown about what happened. Then I'm going to use that to talk about what we know about Brynn. So this includes the hard truths, the things that sort of leave her with room for growth, but also the sad truths and the things that are much more about trauma than they are about her as a person. And that will bring us to then talking about how could this have been handled differently, right? Like, so we're just like, what could be, you know what I'm saying? What could be different? And then lastly, I'll end with just sort of like, what's my final thesis, right? Like, I'm going to give you a sense of my thesis right up top, but it actually is more complex than what I'm going to start with because I want to give the background before I give the more complex version of it in order for it to have some grounding. So before I give you my like briefer version of my thesis, I want to say first and foremost, this is not about sides. Both things can be true. Brynn's and Ubah's reactions in the moment made complete sense given their contexts, histories, biases, and perspectives. Now that we've had time to reflect, now that they all have had time to reflect, it's more the responses of the other women, and I would even say of the public, that could be different and could be more forgiving of all folks and their contexts. So absolutely not a critique of anybody in terms of their reactions in the moment. Granted, there are some things I think could have been handled differently, but that's not where I'm not coming from a place of judgment so much as what can we learn from this going forward? And then how could our reflections nowadays, now that this has been some time, how can those be more fine-tuned based on what we know about trauma? So, for example, everyone is saying, yeah, I understand Brynn was definitely assaulted, or in particular, which I really have a hard time hearing, is when some of the women on the show are saying, I'm not doubting her experience, but it's not an experience. Sexual violence is not an experience, right? That word is much more of a positive word. It has much more positive connotations than what we're talking about here. If you really apply a trauma lens to these events, you're going to see them differently. So saying, yeah, I understand, yeah, but not really then, right? Like if you really understood this from a trauma perspective, then how you talked about it would be different. So I want to acknowledge, I don't believe Brynn flat out or really like knowingly lied. But even if she did, I don't think she deserved how her trauma disclosure was handled. Both how it was spoken about after the fact and testimonials, how the producers included it being spoken about, and how it's being responded to now by the public, by media, and by the other women as well. Brynn really did not deserve the focus on her as a liar, quote unquote, and manipulator. Both her castmates and her production shared that. And I want to say we all lie. But people who feel powerless are more likely to lie because it offers a form of power. Brynn was powerless as a little girl, and she learned it's one way to feel power because only she controlled how the other person saw XYZ. So in her childhood, she learned that was a source of strength and power when she felt powerless. This is not the same thing as saying she learned to lie to cover up what she was doing, right? Or she lied to get attention. These are much more negative connotations than how we come to see the idea of lying as a child. She also learned that lying or exaggerating, let's be real, most of the time it's exaggeration, which we'll talk about. She also learned that it can prompt friendship. Right, we see the women talking about the fact that gossiping is what brings them together, and certainly that is a thing that works for women, sort of scapegoating, finding a third person or fourth person to talk about who's not there. What Brynn found is that when she does that with more sensationalism, okay, a little more pizzazz, then that is even more effective, and she thinks of that as a strategy of connection. She's thinking that's bringing us closer that I do that, but it's actually a strategy of disconnection that keeps people just at bay. Because then they're worried she's doing that about them, or they find out that she's exaggerating and feel betrayed. So that is an area for growth for her. Certainly, Brynn definitely could have handled these events differently. Perhaps one could argue that her lack of awareness around how she affected Ubah's image is really even inexcusable. But these are definitely understandable behaviors once you get a sense of the fact that we're working with a traumatized heart and brain here. I have the fewest notes for Ubah. She did the best she could. Obviously, the fact she was sort of yelling down at Brynn is what got her sent to the hotel room, which then also paints her to look like she did something wrong, which is fair. Violence, obviously, we don't condone. And also, it makes a lot of sense given what she was working with. Primarily, it's the things the other women could have done differently that I'm going to focus on, particularly how they spoke about Brynn and about the events of that night in testimonials once they'd had time to process and reflect. Of course, their behavior that night could have been a little bit different too, but it was at least more understandable. So, in sum, I'm going to explain my thesis around why understanding the events through a trauma-sensitive lens shifts how we see what happened and shifts the popular narrative going around that Brynn is quote-unquote crazy, which is an ableist word, or maliciously manipulative. Again, I'm doing this towards a specific end that will be devoid of sides. Both women face trauma in this scenario and re-traumatization. Both women deserve our understanding and compassion, even if choices were made that we can't relate to. In order to get to this thesis at the end, I'm going to share what happened loosely. I just need to share some of the building blocks for my various trauma-focused interpretations and suggestions to make sense. Then I'll share a few notes about what we know about Brynn. I'll end with really suggestions about how this could be handled differently and really the main unifying thesis of my exploration. This is just my own biased opinion about these events and what maybe could have been handled differently or how we could understand some of the reactions differently. There's no intent for shaming and blaming, and I'm open to feedback if folks feel otherwise and want to let us know in the comments. First, some background context. One thing that happened earlier in the finale, so the episode before, was that Ubah referred to Brynn as, quote unquote, maybe you slept with someone to get your job, or to get this, meaning the job on the show. This is a real hot button topic for Brynn, who has been targeted quite a bit around sexual accusations, saying that she dresses sexually, her talk is sexualized, and people talk about how she might be an escort or be offering time with older men for money. Based really solely on the idea that she's been sexualized and people don't necessarily hear her talk about her job. But we do hear her talk about her job in PR, and still people really don't, clock it because it doesn't fit the narrative they have for her. When Ubah said this, it was really disheartening, I think, for Brynn and for all of us, really, because it furthers that narrative of women being undeserving of their job and needing to have sex with men in order to get that job. I would also mention that actually it's sexual violence a lot of times when this happens because men will offer a job in return for sexual favors, which is actually coercion. It's using power to get sexual favors. So actually it's a form of sexual violence a lot of times. But at minimum, it also calls Brynn undeserving of her role. So really, Ubah should not have said that. Brynn should not have had a sort of bizarre reaction to a different context. After Ubah and she fought about this at a later date, a second time or third time, Brynn said, a black woman can't make money. Black woman can't be successful and make money, which was confusing because she's talking about something Ubah said, and Ubah's a black woman who makes money, quite a bit of it, as a model. So that's confusing. Now, if anyone hasn't watched Real Housewives of New York, Ubah is a tall black supermodel. Brynn is a biracial woman who works in PR, and she she definitely is white presenting. Okay, so like white passing, white presenting are the phrases that are often used in this case. Certainly, she has privilege associated with being lighter skinned, and she also has a different form of oppression associated with sort of being invisible. She doesn't really belong to either community because her skin tone doesn't look black, although her features do, but her skin tone being much more white or light, folks who are black really feel that it's unfair for her to sort of claim that part of herself because she doesn't have the same amount of marginalization based on the color of her skin. And then at the same time, she doesn't look entirely white. So, and she was raised by her white grandmother, so she has a lot of white cultural socialization, and she's sort of catching up on her black heritage. So this was just a weird thing to say, and something definitely was not appropriate. It's sort of almost like people are suggesting that she's sort of competing with Ubah for like blackness. Why? I do not know. Actually, I do. It has to do with white supremacy, teaching marginalized groups to fight with one another for resources. Brynn is in background for when this night sort of gets started. One of the things that's happening right before the fight escalates is that Brynn is venting to Raquel, Jessel, and Jenna about Ubah, and she's really getting activated. So she says, she's telling me that I had to sleep with somebody to get this job. My future children are going to see this. She's basically saying, let's go tell your sons, let's tell your son that you sucked dick for your job because my kids are going to watch this. So mind you, one of the mistakes here that's occurred is that Brynn actually is the one who used the phrase suck dick. It wasn't Ubah. So Ubah had said, you slept with someone for this job. Maybe you slept with someone for this job. And Brynn remembered it as you sucked dick to get this job. And she repeatedly says that phrase back to Ubah, and Ubah keeps saying, I didn't say that. But Ubah doesn't mean I didn't say you didn't sleep with someone. She's saying I didn't say the suck dick part. And so that makes Ubah and Brynn keep missing each other because Brynn feels like she's saying she didn't say any of it. It's really painful, I think, for the other women to hear her saying, let's tell your sons, you suck dick for this job. Because, and for sure, Raquel finally sort of says, Brynn, stop. And this is after Raquel had also been up and hugging Brynn in response to what had happened and sort of helping her mourn, really, what was going on with Ubah and the pain she was feeling. But Raquel finally says, Brynn, stop, because she's spinning in circles and making herself more upset by ruminating. So I think at this point, Brynn could probably tell that she was losing their unconditional support. They stopped feeling for her, feeling much compassion because they were sort of like, all right, you've reached, a certain point. And yet Brynn was really trying to scapegoat Ubah to be able to gain closeness with the other women, to be able to gain them on her side or whatever it might be. So I think it's really in response to that she ups the ante. This is when she tells Raquel, Jessel, and Jenna something worse about Ubah, where she says that she, Brynn, is in group treatment for sexual assault. And Ubah knew that. Ubah knew I was raped or sexually assaulted. Meaning, therefore, that when Ubah made the comment about Brynn sleeping with a producer for the job, that Ubah knew Brynn had been sexually assaulted when making that comment. This is something that really starts and jumpstarts the night in question. Okay, so this is where we're going to move into the more in-the-moment stuff, not so much the background context, but here we go. Here's the big stuff. So let me mention, Raquel, Jenna, and Jessel react very strongly to this, at least definitely Raquel and Jenna. Jenna is even crying. Raquel is crying when she's telling us about it in testimonial. Jenna is saying, I cannot imagine that Ubah would make a comment like that, knowing this information. I would imagine that's something sacred and you don't really cross that line. I have to add, I don't think it needs to have been that Brynn was sexually assaulted for this to be something sacred. Because one, you can assume that 70% of women have at least experienced some form of sexual violence that includes sexual harassment, some sort of form of sexual violence. So women in that room, no matter what, some of them have been assaulted or raped. And so using that phrase in front of them is also very triggering. Using it about Brynn certainly is worse. But I just sort of feel like the fact that it's just only sacred if she has been through sexual violence is kind of a bummer. I think it really shouldn't be used at all because it's a patriarchal view of women as being only worthy if they use their bodies. So that said, certainly I can understand why it might seem that much more hurtful if Ubah knew for sure that Brynn had been assaulted in the last 3 years and still said that. So this is what jumpstarts the whole night. Because Brynn chose to tell the three of these women the story, when they come out, Raquel quickly makes sure that Jenna and Jessel are not telling anybody else what Brynn shared with them. She wants to make sure that, they remember this is not ours to tell. So they encourage Ubah, instead of, sort of telling each other what happened there, they encourage Ubah to apologize to Brynn. So they're sort of using that information to encourage an apology, but they don't actually tell Ubah what it is that they've learned here from Brynn. So Ubah does try to apologize. She takes Brynn aside. Brynn really wasn't having it, you could tell from the start, but certainly she had an image in her head of what that would look like to apologize to her. And she remembered that she had rewritten in her mind what Ubah had even said. So she wanted Ubah to say, I'm sorry for saying you suck dick for this job. And Ubah said, I'm not going to say that, because Ubah didn't say that. And so, and the producers do show us the clip of what Ubah said so that we know for sure she didn't say that. So this makes Brynn feel like it's a fake apology. Like, okay, well, Ubah's not going to apologize really for what she did say, so it's over. She walks away, really won't hear it. This is important to mention. This is one of those moments where it's clear that Brynn has a memory of something that's a specific way, and she feels strongly that's exactly how it happened. So she's not just like purposely making up what Ubah said and saying that it was suck dick when she knows it wasn't that. She really thinks that's what Ubah said, because that got rewritten in her head that way. This is a good moment to talk about the psychological concept of the fallibility of memory. So there's a reason witness testimony is being challenged nowadays. And I would also say for all of us, if we were to really record what we said on a daily basis and go back and watch it, we would be shocked by how many things we had rewritten in our mind in a self-serving way. So in a way that makes us feel better about the day or about ourselves or whatever. It's very common. In fact, it's a healthy thing, right? Like our brain is helping us get through the day by remembering things in a certain way or whatever, helping us not dwell or whatever. I think, if one could argue if you're depressed, your memory might be more self-serving in the way that it keeps it depressive, right? So it's self-serving in the way that it wants to keep up what you're feeling. Certainly, you might be surprised by what you listen to if you were to go back and hear. This isn't malicious, okay? So the other thing that's worth mentioning is that with trauma, your brain is on fire, okay? There's a certain fight or flight nature to a lot of things. Survival becomes the main focus. So memory doesn't do well in that circumstance because it's not really needed in order to do fight or flight. Fight or flight is very present moment. So some of your other centers go down because they're not needed. One of those centers is your memory. You don't really need your memory as much to be able to stay in the fight or flight mode, which is, again, present-centered. The other thing that goes down is dreaming. We don't need to be able to dream in order to stay in the present moment for survival. So that's another thing that goes down offline for folks who are in the midst of trauma, whether that's racial trauma, criterion A trauma, etc. So her memory in the wake of trauma is sketchy already, and our memories as humans are sketchy beyond that. There is a whole lot of research on, for example, the idea of sort of hypnosis and coming up with memories or regathered memories or recollected memories after the fact of trauma from in childhood, and how that could be really, really dangerous type of therapy because people can remember things that are not actually their memories or, that are fake. So our memory is even manipulatable. Certainly it is fallible. And I want to point this out because right here, I think people can at least collectively agree that Brynn wasn't trying to maliciously lie about what Ubah said. She's not trying to say, you said suck dick, and just saying that just so that Ubah will disagree or whatever. No, she really thought that's what Ubah said. At this point, the cameras go off. Jessel takes the information she got from Brynn and brings it to Ubah and even says, Ubah, why are you talking to her that way when you know she's been raped? Ubah extremely, extremely strongly reacts. So she's shaking and sobbing, shocked. It's really clear to the other women that she really didn't know or didn't remember, certainly didn't remember that Brynn was a victim or survivor of sexual violence. Ubah gets activated herself and she screams a bit in people's faces. This includes Brynn's, calls Brynn a psycho bitch and so forth. Mind you, also at this point, Jessel makes a comment about Mount Vesuvius regarding Ubah and how that erupted and she pulled the trigger. I want to mention this because this is sexist. This is based on a history in the patriarchy of using natural disasters to refer to women's emotions. So Mount Vesuvius and this idea of sort of a volcano that erupts and you can't put it back together and it's going to destroy everything in its wake. Right, it's going to set everything on fire. That's what she's saying to refer to Ubah, which is just really dangerous, and it's a problem. It sucks. So, right, obviously certainly not Jessel's goal, but it is what happens there. One of the things is that Brynn comes down the hallway to see Aaron, Raquel, and Jenna talking, and she said, is she saying she didn't know? Aaron goes, she's saying she didn't know. And Brynn goes, she didn't know? So she's even saying she didn't know, meaning like, oh, she didn't know. Not like she's just saying she didn't know. So she turns to Aaron and explains what she thinks happened when she told Ubah. So she says, I was on the phone with her and I said, and I was raped 3 years ago and da-da-da. And then Ubah said, let's go, I'll get a car and I'll come and get you. So this is even convincing Aaron, right? Like, okay, so there was something where it made it clear that Ubah heard her. Not just that that Brynn said it, but that Ubah heard her. Raquel screams to Jessel off camera. We see her go talk to her. It's pretty clear she's yelling at her for telling Ubah. Ubah comes out onto camera and yells at Raquel for being mad at Jessel because she's grateful Jessel told her. But then she also yells at Brynn, and sort of just because she's taller than Brynn is sort of yelling down at Brynn, who is then escorted to a bedroom separately by production before Ubah is then brought to a hotel. And Jessel accompanies her there. This is at this point that Brynn tells us, and this is key. Brynn tells us to the camera, in my rant to her, I'm screaming, crying. Why does this keep happening to me? Nobody knows. This is the story of my life, just bad things happening. I was hysterical, so I don't know if she remembered. But in my mind, she knew, right? So at this point in the night, Brynn is still thinking everybody gets that she's the victim here because she thinks that Ubah knew. And she thinks that Ubah was the one who was removed for violence. So everyone's going to think of her as like the one in the right, the victim. And certainly she was, right? She was a victim of sexual violence, and that turned into a very big fight. And in her mind, Ubah knew. So this, again, not malicious lying. That's not something a malicious liar says. It's also not something someone makes up. This is really clear to me that she genuinely believed Ubah knew. Now, what does that mean? That means Brynn really should have slowed down and thought about whether Ubah ever clocked it or mentioned it to her or said, oh, wow, that was a lot. Or, oh, wow, thank you for telling me. You know, she could have slowed down and thought about it then rather than waiting for someone to ask her directly, did Ubah know? Or better yet, she could have said, I told Ubah. I don't know if she heard me, but I did tell her. And it's possible she knows, and she still made that comment, right? Again, thinking about this from Brynn's perspective, she's thinking everybody understands I'm the victim here. So Brynn then goes into a bedroom where the rest of the girls are, and she shares the details of the trauma. Jenna, referring to this as, you know, it was like a child trying to find comfort, which makes a ton of sense because it's extremely vulnerable. It's painful. It is oftentimes re-traumatizing. It can be re-traumatizing just if somebody tells the story too quickly. So this is something we learn and when we give trauma therapy. We don't want a client to just rattle off their sexual violence story because that can be re-traumatizing. We want to slow down, check in with the client, make sure they're staying in their window of tolerance. If they're getting activated, it's going to be useless and re-traumatizing. If they're hypoactivated, again, useless. We want them right in the window of tolerance. Hypoactivated is numb, so the opposite of activated, or, you know, opposite of agitated, kind of activated. At this point, I'm thinking, okay, Brynn is disclosing sexual violence to a group of friends. If this is handled wrong, so like if she rattles it off too quickly, or if people don't respond to her with empathy and care, this will be re-traumatizing. It has a huge likelihood of that, just given the scenario. These women are coming into this scenario frustrated, thinking that, you know, they've just seen Ubah swear up and down that she did not know. So they're like, why would she say that or look, you know, act like that if she knew? So they're all already talking to each other about that when Brynn comes in and tells them about the trauma. Brynn's coming in thinking we're all on the same page that she's the victim. Really, they're thinking more suspiciously of her coming into the scenario. So this is a recipe for disaster, certainly for re-traumatization of Brynn. Brynn tells more of the details. Sai then asks her, did Ubah know? Apparently, according to Aaron, Brynn then said, come to think of it, maybe she didn't clock it. Sai eventually says, let's go to bed. Brynn leaves the room. Sai gets up and sort of does this like, what the fuck? You know, sort of mouths, what the F? She's showing us that she says that right away. Again, we know, okay, so they were clearly frustrated with Brynn, feeling like she lied. Right now, right here, we are immediately getting a tinted or tainted narrative from Sai about what happened. It's immediately biased. So she is saying, what the F, right? Showing she's feeling really deeply betrayed. Brynn comes back in because no one follows her out. So again, from her perspective, I've just disclosed this to the group. Sai said, let's go to bed. I start walking out. Why is no one coming with me? Why is no one checking in with me to say how I'm doing? To say what happened or say, wow, thank you so much for sharing that. Wow, are you okay? No one's checking in with her. So that's confusing. So she goes back into the room. And it's like, hi guys, kind of like, what are we doing here? Sai refers to this as Brynn is checking the temperature. Okay. So she also says she has overplayed her hand in front of all of us. Both of those things are very victim blaming. They're very much adding this sort of manipulative language to Brynn's behavior. When really, if any of us had disclosed a sexual violence trauma, our friends were on a different page that we did not know about, and then they did not follow me out after saying, let's go to bed, and they were all in the room together, we would all want to go back in and see what happened, right? That's a very natural human thing. Doesn't need to be a manipulative person thing. Okay. So the other thing, by the way, is that we know that she also said to Jenna, Aaron, and I think Raquel in the hallway, she didn't know. So she thinks that they've already known, that she was wondering if they knew, if Ubah knew. And just wondering if Ubah knew is not the same thing as knowing Ubah didn't know, right? So that is the other piece that's really important, is like, to Brynn, even though she's admitting maybe Ubah didn't know, she's still thinking everyone gets, like, I thought she knew. I wasn't maliciously saying that, thinking that Ubah didn't know. You know, everyone's sort of assigning this malice to it, where it's like, oh my gosh, Ubah didn't know. How dare Brynn say all this when Ubah didn't know? It's like she thought Ubah knew, so that's why she said it. So she really doesn't understand and wouldn't understand why everyone sort of has this other version of what happened as like a really serious offense. So in the moment where their reaction hung in the balance, really, typically disclosures are responded to with care and empathy. That's not what she got. So this made this disclosure re-traumatizing. So now she's operating under fight or flight right now, right as soon as she realizes people are not responding the way she would expect. Their reaction is hanging in the balance, and she's operating under fight or flight, plus she's been drinking. She ends up going alone back to her room. Again, weird. Nobody's, even just staying with her after that conversation. So she ends up texting this producer, I want to go home. And the producer says, okay, we'll have a car ready for you at such and such time. We also see in the text messages that they show us that the producer had also said to her, we have a security officer inside. By the way, there's been one the whole time, but tonight we have a female security officer inside the building. So that shows that they are essentially reifying for Brynn that she is the victim of Ubah's violence. They're saying, like, don't worry, you're safe. Okay. So again, this is reifying what Brynn thinks, which is like, people understand that I'm the victim here, right? Like, this clearly, this is not her playing the victim. This is her saying, like, isn't that what this is though? Like, aren't I? Given that that's what happened, right? Ubah got taken away. Ubah got angry, right? Like, maybe I said something that led to a misunderstanding, but I was not maliciously doing that. So I don't understand why, right? I would not understand why, as somebody who was in her shoes, understand why people were reacting the way they were. So, following morning, again, imagine from Brynn's perspective. She was alone last night. She disclosed to a group of friends, was not particularly comforted by them in that scenario. And then after the group split, people were, not coming and seeing me. And first of all, they didn't split the way they said they would, and then they weren't coming to see me afterwards. So she's feeling vindicated and feeling victimized because the disclosure was re-traumatizing and because Ubah was the one who was removed. So she decides, probably, right? I would imagine, this is how I would say, how I would suggest behaving the next morning, right? I realize everybody's on a different page than I am. Maybe they're feeling weird. Maybe they don't know how to respond to the sexual violence. So she decides, and I would imagine she would think, I need to sort of play it cool, and hopefully people will come to me to comfort me rather than needing to act like a victim. Because maybe she gets feedback that she acts like a victim. Certainly people who are victims and survivors are very attuned and worried about being seen as like playing the victim. And so I think she honestly might have thought, if I am a mess, people will tell me I'm acting like a victim. And I don't want to be seen that way. I want to be seen as a strong survivor. I'm okay. Even though I was assaulted, I'm okay. I don't want them to think that I'm, weepy about Ubah, or thinking that like Ubah attacked me and therefore I need to be taken care of, right? So maybe she's also thinking, I can't act all out of sorts because then it'll look like I'm saying Ubah is an angry Black woman. So there are multiple reasons why she might act normal the next morning or try to not look like a victim. The other thing is, it's very common. She ends up sort of mentioning that, she said, I'm psycho like that, which by the way is ableism and self-directed ableism, internalized ableism. But she said, I'm psycho like that, in the way that she can do a 180 the next day and act like everything's fine. It's called compartmentalization. And that's a really important defense mechanism for people with trauma. How are they going to get through a day at work if they can't put aside what happened to them in a different box, put that in a box away in their mind? Similarly, you might have to interact with your perpetrator again. So how can you do that if you're not able to completely dissociate out a part of yourself and pretend like that didn't happen? So it's a common defense mechanism. It can definitely get misunderstood as lack of interest or faking it or whatever, when it's really just compartmentalization and an important defense mechanism. So she's out there speaking with production. Bravo puts up a title card at this moment where they say, in the morning before the cameras come up, production sits with Brynn to make sure she's okay. That's not what this is. I want to be really clear. You can tell from the producer's body language and where Brynn's sitting that she just came and joined them. They were already sitting there, and she came and joined them on a different couch nearby. So that's wild that they tried to relabel it that way. But then, yeah, she's sort of sitting in another spot of the couch a little bit later when Sai comes out as well. Sai comes over, and the first thing out of Brynn's mouth is, I have a car service coming for me at such and such time. And yet to us, straight to camera, Sai is narrating this as, Brynn, I see Brynn the next morning, and she just acts like nothing happened. Okay, right? I just explained like 3 reasons why Brynn would try to not show a whole lot of emotion in a way that is smart and protecting not just her, but Ubah. Sai asks her if she's feeling better than yesterday. So remember, Brynn is thinking, I deserve comfort. So like, if I act like I need comfort, people probably won't give it to me because they'll think I'm acting like a victim. So I need to just let them come to me with comfort. And here Sai is saying, are you feeling better than yesterday? So that she might take that as, here she is comforting me. So that kind of reifies for Brynn, right? I knew I was someone who deserved comforting in this scenario. And yet Sai is turning everything Brynn says against her. Brynn explains that she realizes they need to just film today and get that over with. I want to mention also, she knows that some of last night's events wasn't on film. So she's assuming a lot of that won't even come up because the cameras went down. So she says straight up to Sai, I think we just need to film this, get it over with, and then we'll talk about all of it later. Meaning off camera. Meaning let's do our job, let's get on camera, act like everything's fine, and then we can talk about what went down off camera when we're off camera later. So right there, that shows us that Brynn knows it's not like nothing happened. She knows they have a job to do first, which was said other times in the episode as well, by the way. Aaron brought that up in terms of getting through the main titles, filming the main titles. Brynn said it the day of filming titles, where she said, I just have a job, I just have to get it over with. So this is an attitude they have, right? Let's just get through it. It sucks, but it's part of our expectations for this job, so we just have to film, even though we don't feel like it. That's awful, by the way. They have to act like everything's hunky-dory when they're falling apart. Just because it's part of their job. So that's really upsetting. It is also re-traumatizing. But it shows us that Brynn was saying to Sai, I know it's not all the same. I know it's not all okay. I know something went down. Okay? So then Sai says back to her, so just try to have a super fun day. And Brynn says back, well, just try to have a fun day. Again, this is showing us that she's telling Sai, I'm not okay, right? She's saying, well, I'm not even going to pretend to have a super fun day. Let's just pretend to have a fun day, right? So Sai says to us, what do you mean? As if Brynn saying, let's just try to have a fun day is a problem, when Sai said it first and said super fun, and Brynn took it down a notch. I don't get it. So then Brynn leaves. So she's leaving the location they're all at in Puerto Rico. She hugs everybody, and everybody's really comforting towards her. They're very normal, acting like they're so sorry she's not doing well, right? They're again reifying to her that she is the victim, and that everything that she's been seeing it like as or whatever is how they see it. So we know that they treated her this way because later when we skip ahead, and we're in the moment when they are filming the opening credits, Erin refers to everything. She points her at production and everything and says maybe she's realizing it, or figuring it out, meaning maybe she's figuring out that there was a bigger deal happening in response to her than they had let on. So she's acknowledging they all faked it to Brynn that everything was fine when secretly they were all feeling betrayed by her. No one told her. At this point, though, she's leaving, hugging goodbye. Producers decide to cut the day short, and we cut to see people packing. Women are on the patio, debriefing the night before at this point. So, right, still with Jessel and Ubah, or at the hotel still at this point, Brynn is gone. This starts with Erin saying she's really unwell about the whole thing. Jenna says to everybody, well, it's clear Ubah didn't know. Soon this is going to spiral into a lambasting of Brynn as a liar, both by the women and by production. In the meantime, Jenna says to the group, right, I am assuming something happened, but I feel a little taken advantage of. That's a rough statement to say in response to sexual violence. This is something that Brynn was actually taken advantage of, right? And so saying that in response to that about something that she very unknowingly did, okay? Rough. So Sai says to us, I do not doubt something horrific happened to Brynn. She probably lied so much as a child to cover up that it bleeds into her adulthood. So it's a secondary sentence in there. Whoa, right? Right away, victim blaming. Lied so much as a kid to cover up. To cover up what? So this is where I would challenge that with people learn, especially with childhood trauma, that lying is a source of finding power. It can also be a safety mechanism, a way of staying alive, surviving. So, no. Sai says to the group, she's going to be calling you two the most, meaning Jenna and Erin. She's going to try to rectify this situation. Erin goes, she texted me. And then it turned out that Brynn said, are you getting out of there today? Raquel right away says, yeah, right. She's concerned that we're staying here without her and talking about it. Raquel says to us on camera, says to the camera, I've seen this before. It's like Narcissism 101. Is this like Narcissism 101 or is it like Trauma 101? And she says this is like making it about themselves. She's, she's worried. She was worried about herself, not the madness, by the way. That word ableism is also ableist. Not about the madness she just unleashed on us or about whether Ubah was okay. That was not of concern. We don't know that. We don't know what her concern was about Ubah. And frankly, she felt barely like she could say anything, it sounds like to me. The other thing I want to mention is that trauma, right, we get a directed in an inward directed sense of reality because we need to protect ourselves to survive. And that can look a lot like, being narcissistic or conceited. But it's actually a survival mechanism to focus on oneself enough to survive. The same thing happens with medical trauma. So someone who is very, very ill can start to become very self-focused because it's part of how they survive. They have to focus more on themselves in those moments. So it can look like they're conceited or disrespectful, but it will change when they're out of the acute state of medical trauma. Similarly, I've used that to apply that same kind of concept to those who transition in terms of gender, because I've heard of a pattern from my clients who either have a family member who's transitioning or who is going through transition themselves of sort of being seen as conceited or self-centered, folks who are trans, just in the process of transitioning, however. So if we apply that same model, well, with a medical trauma, this self-directed energy happens where people are very self-focused in order to survive. If we apply that model to it, it makes a lot of sense, right? Certainly the times that I've heard those examples of folks who are transitioning, it has gone away when they finish transitioning. So anyway, that's that. Raquel also says, how could Ubah explain it to Mr. Connecticut without him thinking that she too could potentially be crazy? She too could potentially be crazy? Meaning you do think Brynn is crazy. Again, this is the sort of ableism. It's a real problem. And Raquel is married to a neuropsychologist, so this is a bummer, but it doesn't mean the neuropsychologist, her wife, does therapy, which would be another reason to really focus on the ableism, but I do tend to think anybody in the field of psychology should know that it's ableist to think about it that way. Anyway, Raquel says to everybody, we have main titles in a couple days. What are we going to do? And Aaron says, we have to get through it, right? So this parallels Brynn's comments earlier about filming needed to happen first. Everyone starts talking about her lying about everything. This starts with Sai going, it's like a big right? Meaning like, told you so, or we knew this. And Aaron goes, yeah. And then she looks to Jenna and she goes, now do you believe that I didn't call you poor? Whoa, right? And then Raquel says, or that she wasn't in on the prank, talking to Aaron. These examples are tough, okay? Because A, we actually know for sure that Brynn was aware of at least half the prank. So that was not a lie at all. She was able to tell, ironically, Ubah about the prank before anyone else came forward about it, which means she had to have known ahead of time. Not lying. The other thing was about saying that Jenna's poor. Right. Like, so Aaron, what she's missing is that what she said that Brynn was lying about was that Aaron wasn't joking about it. She's saying, I did talk about that kind of stuff, but I was joking. And Brynn made it sound like I was being serious. This is where I want to come back to a theory I talked about with Brynn quite a while ago. I don't think Brynn is lying maliciously. For one, as we talked about earlier, just in this conversation, she will store things away in a certain way that's self-serving, as we all do, literally. By the way, every memory we have is a product of when we are remembering it and for whom we are remembering it. So what is the context in which I'm bringing up this memory? That's going to affect what the memory is. Isn't that wild? So my memory when telling you a story is going to be quite different from when I'm telling my significant other a story with a specific goal, like in order to get something out of him or something. Then when the story changes and I believe it, it's not like it changes in a way that I'm consciously like, oh, It's like that my actual memory changes. Wild, right? That's really pretty cool. It also means fuck it about remembering something one way and someone else remembers something else a different way. Of course, you both remember it differently. Fighting about it does not help. In fact, it probably is something, right? We always talk about this. It's something somewhere in the middle. It's neither one of you is right. Because we all have self-serving, fallible memories. That's also why I became really a staunch social constructionist, because we all have our own realities. We're all living in our own realities. There's no objective reality because all of us are remembering everything wrong, frankly. The cool thing is it's also really freeing, right? It's a little disturbing because you're like, wow, like I'm just never going to align with someone else on what happened, right? True, frankly, that is a little disturbing, but after some time, it feels really freeing because then you're able to say like, right, like I just know I might be wrong and that's okay, right? Like, so are they, so are we all. There's a reason our brains do that. So anyway, let me pivot into that again for a second, but I want to go back to my theory about Brynn. So my theory about Brynn is that she's not specifically lying in these scenarios. What she does is she takes the underlying emotion and amplifies that as the truth. So she probably remembers it that way as well. She remembers the underlying emotion, not what's happening on the surface. So for example, in this example with Jenna even acknowledged to us directly to camera that she was frustrated with Jenna for not paying for the Uber. And so, but she also was joking about it to Brynn and so forth. She made a joke, and Jessel, she made a joke about Jenna being poor. Like, what is she, like, poor? What is she, can't she have money problems? Like, sort of making a joke about it because she's frustrated, and it was her way of expressing her frustration, which she straight up tells us that, okay? Like, almost word for word. And so Brynn wasn't lying about the fact that Aaron was expressing frustration or worry that Jenna was poor, because she was underneath the surface. But on the top of it, she was joking. And that's what they get mad at her for lying about, is like, and Jessel too, Jessel says, well, yeah, I think she was just joking. Right. Just joking? Or was the joking like a vehicle for expressing what she really felt? And that's what Brynn picked up on and remembered it as, is what the humor was a vehicle for. So Aaron, understandably, gets pissed at Brynn for saying that and calls her a liar because there's a reason that was unspoken. Brynn is picking up on the unspoken material, and there's a reason the person chose not to speak that material. So of course they're going to be pissed if someone else speaks that material as if they had. Aaron did not want to be seen as frustrated with Jenna, so that's why she made a joke. So then for Brynn to call it that embarrassed Aaron to Jenna, so Aaron called Brynn a liar, okay? This happens over and over and over to Brynn. She picks up on the underlying material. She remembers it. She shares the underlying material. The person gets mad because they don't want the underlying material to be coming out, because that's why they did this other thing on the surface. And she stands by her memory of it because she's also right. That was a part of it, right? But it wasn't the explicit part. It was the implicit part. It's kind of a skill. So, I mean, it's something that develops also in response to trauma, where understanding what the underlying content is a survival mechanism, because it's also the underlying content that tells you what will this person do next. If somebody's being sarcastic about something, if you take them at face value, that's not going to tell you anything about that person. You need to know what they actually think and feel, which is underneath the surface, in order to know if you're going to survive or how to. So it's actually a quite attuned survival mechanism. So these two examples are both examples of that, which is frustrating. And actually, the one about the prank isn't even that. The one about the prank, she actually was told about it. That's frustrating for me. I'm watching that. I'm like, what? These aren't good examples of why that would have been a lie. I don't get it. And then it gets worse, because then production piles on and joins in the blaming or victim blaming of Brynn by playing a montage of apparently times when Brynn has lied. This montage is wild because these are not lies. So the first example is from the first season, where she straight up says at the beginning of it, "This is my interpretation of what Aaron said." Then she goes on to say the example about how Sai said, "Well, that's weird," about the cheese. She's telling this story to Jessel and Sai as if that was Aaron talking trash about Sai. So the next example was Aaron thinking that it's weird that Pavit wasn't wearing his wedding ring. And then the third example was saying, telling Ubah at the party, "Ubah, I hear you got a man in Connecticut." That was true. That's a true thing. And then the piece about Aaron saying that Jenna was having money problems and the car broke down, which I've already addressed. And then the thing about the prank. Okay. So each of these stories, these were things that had nuggets of truth. These are all things that either were completely true, and I just don't even understand why they were given as examples, or things where there was a nugget of truth that was amplified. Aaron ends up telling us to the camera, "Well, I believe the truth always comes out." Again, we're creating Brynn as like the bad guy whose truth we need to make sure we uncover. We all do this, friends, okay? Sai goes on to say, she changes the situation to work in her favor, and she says it in a way that makes it seem so believable that people take her side. Again, we all do this. It's a self-serving rewriting of stories. We want people to take our side. That's not a surprise. Jessel and Ubah come back to the patio. Basically, Ubah says, "I don't want to go back there." Jenna says, "We don't have to, but I just want to make sure you know that we all believe that you did not know." And so then Aaron adds, "Well, yeah, she said that when she called you to tell you about something going on, she had said it to you, but that maybe you didn't clock it." She said an hour later, "Well, maybe she didn't clock it." When Aaron says this to Ubah, that Brynn said, "Well, maybe she didn't clock it," Ubah didn't disagree with that. I feel like it's possible. Ubah just didn't clock it, right? Yeah, says Jenna. "I also think like if you had clocked it, I'm sure you would have circled back and said, let's talk about what you had talked about." I have to say, I don't think it's surprising that Brynn might not have thought that Ubah would do that, because people with sexual violence histories are aware of the fact that a lot of people are very uncomfortable talking about that. So it wouldn't be surprising if someone wouldn't want to circle back to it if you don't make them. The fact that there's people, this is something that Ubah says, the fact there's people, the three of you were out there believing that I knew this, and she's trying to leverage how I said she slept with someone. She's trying to leverage you against me. There's no doubt in our minds, Ubah, says the group of women. Ubah tells us to the camera, "I'm just grateful they've seen it with their own eyes and that they're strong enough and that they have good integrity." Well, I also think it might be a time to also acknowledge that it was good of Brynn, and maybe Ubah doesn't need to be the one to do this, but it was good of Brynn also to acknowledge that maybe Ubah didn't clock it. She could have taken that with her, which is also the point, right, about why it's dangerous that she might have been misleading people, is because if she hadn't told them she was, then Ubah would still look like she knew. So now we skip ahead to when they're filming the opening credits. That these are the things that folks are going to be having at the beginning of their episodes. So it's them each saying their lines and holding an apple. Brynn comes late. She doesn't want to be mic'd. She ends up telling us to the camera, it's just a weird vibe, an awkward vibe, but it's work. We got to do work. Suck it up, whatever. So this is clear to us now that really clearly she still doesn't understand, and nor would she, that everyone else is having this other experience of her and feeling quite critical of her. She takes it as sort of like, well, people are just uncomfortable, don't know what to do, but it's work. Let's just get it done. She also tells us Ubah doesn't even seem bothered, but I'm over here like I want to die inside. These girls really don't give a fuck, compared from her perspective. And I have to say, when we first saw this scene at the beginning of the season, I was looking at who looked the most uncomfortable in the opening credit scenes, and I thought that Brynn really was the only one who seemed quite uncomfortable. So sure enough, we see that in how they're filming, because she's really being left out of everyone else's dynamic. So some of the others say to us on camera, one person, I think it might have been Sai or Aaron, said, or maybe even Jenna, "I think there's a path for all of us if Brynn can really own this." Ooh, I feel like it's a lot more more complicated than anyone is giving credit. I don't think it's just Brynn owning this. I think there was a time where if Brynn had owned that maybe she had a misunderstanding there, it could have gone differently. But at this point, it's not just about that. Sai tells us Brynn lied as a child for attention to hide things happening in her family, so she never learned how to stop doing that. Again, really tough read on why children learn to lie. If a child is looking for attention, it means they're not getting enough attention. So the fact that our response is to deprive them of attention is wild. So no, this is not the negative thing that we're making it out to seem. She learned how to lie in a position where she had to. It was a defense strategy because she felt powerless. Also, she's not lying. She's exaggerating. She's sensationalizing. It's a strategy of connection from her perspective. Doesn't work out that way, but she hopes it will bring people closer. This is the brief overview of what happened. Obviously not that brief. Here's what we know about Brynn. Here are the hard truths, the areas where I think Brynn has some room for growth. I think the comment about why can a Black woman be successful was rough. I don't think she really understood what that looked like or what that means. I mean, Ubah is a Black woman who is making money. Clearly, she thinks Black women should and could. I also think that Brynn disclosed sexual assault to prove a point or to paint Ubah the bigger villain. However, she owned that in her testimonial to us. She was frustrated with herself while crying. She says, I did this to prove a point. The other thing is the strategy I talked about earlier about how she picks up on a true story about an interaction underneath the interaction that goes on and then relays the underlying emotion. People get annoyed with her for doing that because they don't want to be outed for what their actual emotion was. So then they write her off as lying. This isn't really something I would say is like a room for growth per se. I guess I would say maybe that's something she could learn to language a little bit better and sort of say, yeah, like I think on the surface it might have been something else, but I picked up on the sort of vibe that, yeah, you did seem frustrated with Jenna for not paying for the Uber. Brynn is white passing. I will say that's an area where being thoughtful about how her experience is unique from Ubah's is really important. Ubah being a dark Black woman from Somalia. She has a lot more marginalization associated with the color of her skin than Brynn does. And yet Brynn does sort of lump them in together as Black women, and that's sort of tough. So that said, she does have a unique form of minority stress. It's also heavy on oppression, not belonging to either community, feeling very much a lack of belongingness. As I've talked about in my other mental health checkups, the social pain overlap theory suggests that when we experience a lack of emotional or relational safety, it registers in our brain the same way that a lack of physical safety does, because belonging to a group is also part of our survival. So it is actually like a real threat to safety when we feel like we don't belong. And Brynn very much, by being biracial, doesn't feel like she belongs and is therefore in a constant state of fight or flight, just related to her race, let alone related to the sexual assault. So the other piece is important. She had a part of herself really denied by her upbringing, by being raised by a white woman, and sort of later discovering these parts of herself as an adult, while the public is still very much denying this part of her and saying, like, you're not Black because you're white passing. Granted, I don't think people are saying you're not Black, but people are saying, you don't really get to own some of these experiences because you're white passing, which is fair. But to her, it's still saying, it's still denying her that part of herself she's still trying to discover. Brynn, quote unquote, gossips. Yes. As she notes with her friends, gossiping brings people together. It also helps us find out information about people like Weinstein, and the Me Too movement happened because of whisper networks. We also test our understanding of microaggressions in the context of quote-unquote gossip or women's talk. So there is sexism behind even the term gossip. For gossip to have been stigmatized as a concept, that's patriarchy. Women talk about relationships because that's what we are more focused on than men. It is just as important as quote-unquote men's talk, but it's spoken about pejoratively like it isn't. And the use of the word gossip is to sort of relegate it to the margins as an unimportant type of talk, when it's quite important for the reasons I just mentioned. We also can talk about the fact that, for example, Sai pulled Aaron, Brynn, and Jessel into a room to get Aaron to explain to Jessel that Aaron was also talking shit about Jessel, because Aaron told Jessel, Sai, Brynn, and I were down at the pool and they were talking shit about you. I didn't say anything. I was just sitting there. So then when Jessel reports that to Sai, Sai's like, whoa. Aaron was also talking shit. It brings them all into a room. Within moments, Aaron has redirected the attention to be about Jessel for what Pavitt said about Sai. So Aaron says, well, I was just bringing up what Pavitt said about Sai's mental health because I know that still bothers her. And Sai looks to Jessel and she says, it really does still bother me. So now Jessel's suddenly defending Pavitt, and it turns into everybody hugging because Sai has sort of expressed being mad at Pavitt still and, whatever. So frankly, the scapegoating of Jessel is thick. It's so thick that in front of Jessel, it happens as a diversion so that the fight between Aaron and Sai does not occur. So interesting, right? This is the same idea of what started the scapegoating about Jessel to begin with, was to bring Aaron, Sai, and Brynn back together after they've had a sort of falling out among the three of them, because gossip is the thing that does that for them, which they acknowledge. Okay. These girls all tend to need a scapegoat in order to be okay with each other. It's not just Brynn doing the scapegoating. But of course, it is different when she's coming for Ubah around the issue of race as a lighter-skinned woman. It's also different about the way of sort of sexualizing Brynn, whether in the wake of learning she's been a victim of sexual violence or not. Obviously, it turns out that Ubah did not know that, or did not remember, or didn't hear that, which is totally understandable. I still think there are certain ways in which scapegoating each other around certain issues is really not okay. Whether it's about race or about sexual violence, you're doing the work of the patriarchy there. right? Like using the arguments of the patriarchy to bring each other down. Those are the hard truths, areas for growth. Here are the sad truths. Here's what we need to know about trauma to understand Brynn. First, I want to just add as a disclaimer, people can have similar forms of trauma to Brynn and not develop these specific strategies. And yet these are common strategies. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some common trauma things that help us understand the context of Brynn's behaviors. I will also mention that Brynn didn't just have sexual violence as a trauma. She had childhood trauma, which we call complex trauma, when you have both attachment and childhood trauma and later traumas that come up. So this is not unique to Brynn. This is a common complex trauma context. So Brynn's sexually provocative language and behavior likely stemmed from learning what would get her needs met. She grew up with very little. Now she refers to sort of dating billionaires, right? And that's a form of feeling powerful, understandably, because if she can use her sexuality to gain favor of a billionaire, she doesn't feel like she has nothing anymore. This is also understandable because patriarchy teaches women that part of what's valuable about us is our bodies. So even in response to sexual violence, survivors of sexual violence have a difficult time recognizing red flags. So, right, I've experienced sexual violence, but now I'm also going to have a hard time recognizing red flags. There's a reason for this, which is one that is theorized, is that in the wake of a violence or a violent trauma, we might recreate the circumstances for it in the hopes that we can beat it next time. So that results in sort of a missing of the red flags because you almost hope that the same thing might happen so that you can do something different, have a different outcome. This comes from a place of self-blaming where you think I could have done something different to avoid it, or in some cases that's just not the case. And so recreating the circumstances will actually result in the same outcome because you really weren't at fault and weren't able to change it. Another thing that's sort of understanding her sexually provocative language and her behavior, learning that that's one of the only ways she has power and so forth. Related to that a little bit, we get stuck at the developmental age at which we first experience a trauma, and Brynn was first traumatized as a child, so the fact she uses baby voice could be a result of that. It could also be a result of the patriarchal fetishization of children, which can look like infantilizing women, because it's safer than actually assaulting children. And so if we can fetishize women who use baby voice, because that's a way of sort of getting at that fetishization of children, then that's a little bit safer, and that can result in women learning that baby voice is cute or seen as attractive. Problematic, of course, but not her fault, certainly. I also want to really emphasize our disclosure of sexual violence experiences is so important. When we choose to disclose that, it is a huge vulnerable risk. If it's not received well, we're re-traumatized. I mentioned this earlier. Certainly, if it's not received with care and empathy, that's a re-traumatizing factor. The fact she was alone after doing that is re-traumatizing. Her brain felt unsafe because she was alone. She did not belong with anybody in those moments while she was sleeping alone. That's why she decided she wanted to go home. Felt that real lack of belongingness, that threat to safety, and therefore fight or flight. Literally flight is what she chose. So these are factors that show us that it was re-traumatizing how it was responded to. I would also mention the very public nature of it was very traumatizing. She knew this was something that now at least this whole group knows, so that's public in its own way. But also because she brought it up on camera, she now knows it's definitely coming out this season. It's definitely something she's going to have to talk about. Granted, she did talk about it a little bit with her brother, but that was in a much vaguer way. So that this is a different type of disclosure. This is more emotional. It's also done in a way that, as she mentioned, was sort of to prove a point. So she must have been feeling all sorts of shame for how this came out and concern. Again, re-traumatizing to the max. The other piece that is now re-traumatizing today is this severe amount of victim blaming that's coming out in response to how this went down. Let me explain that victim blaming is one of those factors in the literature that shows that something will be far more traumatizing. It will cause more PTSD if someone is victim blamed in the wake of disclosing their trauma. Granted, she's not being victim blamed for the assault, but the way that we talk about her sexualization or the way that she's dresses or talks provocatively, that is a form of victim blaming, because you're sort of saying if she didn't, maybe she wouldn't have been victimized. I don't think that's being said directly necessarily. I'm sure someone is, unfortunately, but it is still a link that's easy to make. So those are problems. Those are things that are going to make it more traumatizing for her as well. At its base, she was disclosing a trauma. She was unaware of the fact everyone had this other view of her. So she was thinking it was her fault that everyone was reacting the way they were reacting. That, again, internalizes that self-blame, internalizes the victim blaming, and really makes it much more traumatizing. Okay, maybe she misunderstood and misremembered that Ubah knew versus she told Ubah. I believe she told Ubah. She remembered she told Ubah. That is just, I think at this point can be accepted as a fact that she told Ubah as about whether Ubah remembered it. And she made a jump to think that Ubah remembered it. This is also a common trauma reaction. Okay, twofold. One, it is a common core belief for folks with sexual violence trauma to believe, quote unquote, everyone knows. A part of believing that everyone knows, that can have to do with how public the assault was. Sometimes this comes later, depending on when it becomes public and so forth. Certainly now, I'm sure Brynn believes everybody knows about it, because many people do. But not everyone does. And so that is still her brain overworking and sort of overgeneralizing the rule. And that's common with trauma, in part out of a need for safety. Because if I assume you know and I operate from that position, it's much safer for me than if I assume you don't know and it turns out you do. Okay, because then you could take advantage of me in a way I'm not ready for. So it's much safer to assume people know. Similarly, it's much safer to assume Ubah knew rather than just to assume she told Ubah. Because if she operates under the idea that Ubah didn't hear her, then it could open her up to vulnerability that she's not prepared for versus if she just assumes Ubah knows. So no wonder she thought in her head, Ubah knows. And she was drinking. So the judgment brain, the part of her that was able to say, hey, maybe I say this in a different way, was turned off. So no wonder, okay, this does not mean she's maliciously lying. Frankly, even if she were, does she deserve how re-traumatizing this reaction has been? No, nobody does. Any bit of this is not deserving of how she's been responded to, both by these women and by production, but then also both back then and now, and how the public is reacting to her as well. No one is deserving of this type of reaction. Absolutely, the outcome of what her misunderstanding was horrific for Ubah. Horrific. She was also traumatized in this. This does not take away the fact that Ubah was also traumatized. Both things can be true. Both things can be responded to in a way that takes the gravity on deck without it abandoning the other. That's what we're missing here. That's how this could have been received differently. I also want to reiterate the point about compartmentalization, and so how she reacted the next day as a safety mechanism for folks with sexual violence trauma, where if I don't continue sort of, for example, we get told all the time, folks with sexual violence trauma, we're told all the time that we're sort of acting like a victim. So coming in with a stronger facade, at least would open her up to then just receiving comfort rather than looking like she's looking for it. Because then that, again, when a child looks like they're looking for attention, they're not given it, which is wild, because if someone's looking for attention, it's because they need it. Certainly, if she looked like she was needing comfort from folks, she feared that she wouldn't be given it. So that makes sense why she was so calm the next day. Jenna also had a really nice read on it where she said, I get it. She thought in that morning, the best thing I can do for myself is pretend it didn't happen. Sure, that's also true. I think even beyond that, though, these other pieces are also true. Compartmentalization is an important skill, safety skill, and certainly I covered this earlier. So, there's more to be said about it that I said earlier as well. I also want to return to the idea that how folks reacted to her that night was re-traumatizing in sort of like creating a like sort of caucus without her, everybody talking about her, and she came back and they were whispering. No one was actually following her to bed. She got abandoned that night. She was then abandoned after the next morning as well, where she hadn't seen some of these people in quite a while when they came back to do the credits and felt very othered when she came back. So she was again abandoned in other ways as well. I really think that for her to be made out to be a villain in this manner is really, really re-traumatizing in a way that I don't think anyone really wants to do, right? Like I hope people aren't trying to perpetrate that. I still think it's okay to hold her accountable for the mistake, and how if she had owned the mistake in a different way earlier in the process, it might have looked different. That said, pretty early on, she came down the hall and said she doesn't know. So she's acknowledging that maybe Ubah didn't know, even though she said it. So I think she kind of did try to bring it up earlier. This is where I want to move into how could this have been handled differently. Again, disclaimer, everyone's reaction is valid. It came up in a moment that made complete sense given their context, histories, biases, and perspectives. But now that we've had time to reflect, there are ways in which folks could react differently or respond differently, including when testimonials were recorded for the other women. So I think we can both hold Brynn accountable and avoid abandonment of her after the disclosure of a sexual assault. Brynn and Ubah's fight wouldn't escalate if Brynn was able to speak directly to Ubah about it, and if Brynn were also able to use language like, I told you, not you knew. But once the fight was in play, Brynn using the words like, maybe she didn't clock it, could have been changed to be something like, I guess it's possible she didn't hear what I said since I was yelling a lot, but I did tell her 100%. And I've felt genuinely this whole time that she did know, right? So that looks a little different. She also could have said to the women, I should really speak to Ubah about this because maybe she didn't realize what I'd said. If I'm incorrect about her knowing, I will make sure to make this right and make it clear on camera that I've made a mistake in assuming she understood what I told her that day. I do think Ubah's comment was disturbing just because we can assume with the high rates of sexual violence that one of us would have been triggered, if not me, even if she didn't know what I had said that day about having been the victim of sexual violence, but it certainly is much less disturbing given that she didn't. I also think that Brynn could say to them, I want to apologize to you all because I know it created a lot of emotion in you all too to believe Ubah knew when she said that, when she might not have. I do need to apologize to Ubah first and foremost if this is the case, but I'm also sorry to you all for the emotion I caused you. I think this would have ended there potentially with them, and then she could have had the same convo with Ubah, appeared on camera, took ownership of her assumption, not for lying, right? That's the part that gets really frustrating, is people calling her a liar out of this. That's it. That's all I got for Brynn. I think, honestly, the rest of it, and even that, I sort of think she did some sort of little bits and bobs of that. And I believe that it would be very hard for her to do that kind of pivot while drinking and in the face of trying to also receive comfort for disclosing the sexual violence. Here's where I think the women's reactions could have been different. Someone could have said to Brynn, when they're in the conversation where Brynn is disclosing sexual violence and she says, well, maybe Ubah didn't clock it. Someone could have said, Brynn, really, I just want to talk about this for a second. What you went through was not okay, no matter what. The sexual violence that you survived is so severe and scary, and I'm really glad you're okay. And it also makes so much sense that you are not okay in some ways. It was very powerful and vulnerable of you to share it with us no matter what. I also don't want you to feel abandoned by us, but I feel that pull to withdraw because I'm also thinking about how serious this was for Ubah. I want to be clear that I'm just feeling a little bit funny about the fact that you think Ubah may not have actually known when that's what this whole fight was about, because Ubah got really upset and she's going to look a certain way when this is seen, and it's all over an assumption that you made. You should definitely speak with Ubah, find out if she remembers what you're talking about. You should then think about how you can repair on camera so she's not seen in this way. It makes sense that the fact you felt you vulnerably disclosed to her would lead you to assume she heard you, in part because it's safer to assume that than to assume she didn't. But once you speak to Ubah about it and correct it on camera, it should all be fine. We really want to support you around your disclosure. How are you feeling? How are you feeling right now? What could help you feel comfortable now that we know this? How should we refer to it? Should we refer to it? Should we ignore it? Should we check in with you about it? And so forth, right? So then there can still be some checking in with Brynn about her own safety, having disclosed this, while also acknowledging and that she needs to hold herself accountable for the mistake she made with Ubah. The women could have reacted differently by not abandoning Brynn after she disclosed it. She talked about how everything felt awkward. She didn't know what she did, which is really disorienting. So both that night and at the photo shoot, she's now going to be self-blaming around it. When speaking about Brynn, they could not use language like crazy, manipulative, psycho, lying. I think also not calling the sexual violence an experience. That is wild. I think they could also be far more understanding about the idea of misremembering events in a self-serving manner, especially in the wake of trauma. And that this is true for all of us, regardless of trauma. I think they also could be far more understanding about Brynn's strategies for survival that developed in the face of various forms of trauma starting in childhood. Sai is halfway there, but she's still using very judgmental, victim-blaming language around like, well, she did it to cover up, or, it's bleeding into adult, No, I think there's much better language to be used about that kind of an assumption. And I think it's a fair assumption that childhood influences her current ways of being, absolutely, especially in the context of childhood trauma, but certainly for all of us, our childhoods have a direct impact on how we are today. So I think the language, was the piece that was left wanting about Sai's reaction. All right, all of this brings me to my final thesis, which is that we should be coming together to fight oppression. We're actually giving patriarchal white supremacy what it wants by fighting with each other about this. This is a diversion. The fact that we make these types of scenarios about sides is part of the problem and part of why patriarchy is winning. We should not be taking sides or making sides between Brynn and Ubah. Rather, and this is also for them, but for us as well as the audience, rather, we can acknowledge they both have trauma. They both were wronged and they both were hurt by the other, as were their images hurt by the other. Deciding whose pain is worse is like playing Oppression Olympics, where it ultimately hurts everyone when we should be working together to fight it. We are in the power down position as women, for certain, those two are as well in terms of being women of color. And so that is how white supremacy and patriarchy win, is they teach people who are in the power down position to fight with each other for reduced resources. And then it just upholds the patriarchy and the white supremacy without them having to do a thing. They can just watch from above while we fight each other. So rather than engaging in that fight that we're being promoted to do, let's work together to fight the oppression that caused all of this to begin with. Because the reason sexual violence is so pernicious, the reason the claim that someone slept with a man to get a job is so pernicious, the reason that suggesting someone knew about sexual violence history when making such a claim is particularly pernicious, the reason someone lying about someone knowing in a way that leads to that person looking like an angry black woman is so pernicious. All of that is because of patriarchy and white supremacy. So both women are victims of patriarchal white supremacist oppression. Instead of focusing on the perpetrator, our societal oppression, they're focused on each other because it's a much more accessible target and perpetrator, which is exactly what patriarchy and white supremacy wants. Those with reduced resources fighting one another instead of working against the machine or the man or the patriarchy or the white supremacy. Similarly, all of us as the audience who has now had time to reflect and think about both women's experiences, both women's traumas, the re-traumatizing nature of how we're reacting to this, I think we really owe it to ourselves as marginalized groups, women of color, to really dig into why these arguments are so powerful. And the reasons are because patriarchy and white supremacy and oppression how do we fight that oppression? Not by fighting each other. We can certainly learn from what was happening here as a way of helping other folks learn from it, but we shouldn't be using it to fight each other, because then we're just giving patriarchy and white supremacy what it wants. That's my full exploration. And this is just my own biased opinion about these events and what maybe could have been handled differently, or how we could understand some of the reactions differently. There's no intent for shaming and blaming in my exploration, and certainly I'm open to feedback about that if people feel that was relevant to my explanation. I'm open to all feedback and comments. I want to hear what you all think about this. Please feel free to follow us, subscribe, review, and join us on social media. So I'm at Dr. K Pods on Instagram. Dr. Ray is at Dr. Ray Pods on Instagram. Our TikTok is at dr.realitv, which is REALITV. You'll also find us at YouTube and Facebook at Reality Test Pod. Our page is called Reality Test Pod on Facebook. Our YouTube handle is at Reality Test Pod, all one word. We also have an email at realitycheckpodding, PODDING, @gmail.com. Please join us on Patreon. We have a lot of content on there that is awesome and exciting and new and fresh and visual and audio. So really, I think you might like what you find. There is stuff that's for free. There is stuff that you pay for. These mental health checkups are typically a paid item. Right now, we're doing a discount on this one because it really, in my heart and mind, is so important. Again, this is my biased opinion. I am a licensed clinical psychologist with a specialty in my private practice for sexual violence trauma. I also am writing a book that I was asked to write on creative healing from sexual violence trauma, and I've done a lot of research and consultation in this area. So certainly, I would say I have the sort of academic version of educated on this. I am myself also a survivor, so I have personal experience with going through trauma work and having it change your life, and that's a big part of why I got into this field. So to me, it is near and dear to my heart. It does not mean, however, that I have a flawless opinion about this. And certainly my hope and dream is an idealistic one, that we could work together to fight oppression rather than needing to create divisions. That said, Ubah and Brynn are both entitled to their reactions. And if Ubah has it in her heart to forgive Brynn, as she said she does just for her own sake, that's beautiful. If she doesn't find that in practice, that's fine too. I do think there's a way in which being hurt by this was very understandable. I also think that those in the surrounding positions have a little bit more of a duty to their friends, both Ubah and Brynn, to respond differently to what went down. I also think production has a really big burden not to victim blame Brynn the way that they have, and not to accuse her of being a liar. Those are my big hot button issues about this. But certainly you'll notice I have quite a few thoughts. So thank you all for listening, sticking it out. If you would like to hear more, again, we're at Patreon. So patreon.com/realitytest. Thank you all so much, and take care of yourselves. We'll see you next session.